Richard Monroe had always believed that keeping a tight grip on everything was the surest way to win at life. He'd built his real estate empire from scratch in downtown Chicago, and everything about his daily routine reflected that need for control. His mornings started exactly at 5:30. Coffee made just how he liked, 2 spoonfuls of sugar and never a drop of cream. Every meeting was blocked off on his calendar weeks ahead of time. Even the people who worked for him, from his assistant to the building staff, seemed almost like background pieces in the smooth machinery of his world. Richard didn't really know any of them on a personal level, and he thought it was best that way. The result was a life that looked immaculate on the surface, planned down to the last detail, free of surprises. But then something odd crept into his controlled environment. It started with small things. A jar of peanut butter that seemed to go down faster than usual, bandages and cold medicine that were gone before he'd even opened them. Sometimes a tin of sardines would vanish, and he was sure he hadn't eaten it. These weren't things anyone would notice unless they monitored every shelf and drawer, but Richard did. At first, he shrugged it off, telling himself he must have simply forgotten, but the little disappearances started to nag at him. There was no anger at first, just a quiet restlessness that slipped into his days and even his sleep. Richard found himself wandering through his apartment, checking cabinets and drawers twice, sometimes 3 times a day. He reviewed the security camera footage from his hallway, but saw nothing out of place. He questioned his housekeeper, Mrs. Lopez, though her wary expression told him she was as baffled as he was. It was as if the perfect order Richard prided himself on had been disturbed by a quiet, invisible hand. And while he wasn't afraid, a gnawing curiosity started to take root. He couldn't focus on his work the same way. Even during his weekly lunch meetings at a cafe near Millennium Park, his mind circled back to what might be slipping away in his absence. The urge to understand who or what was breaking the flow of his meticulously arranged world became impossible to ignore, and he realized he wouldn't be able to rest until he solved the puzzle. Richard decided he would get to the bottom of these little disappearances, but he wanted to do it quietly, without causing gossip or stirring up suspicion among his staff. He started paying close attention to the people who worked in his building. Not that many, just a handful who had been with him for years. Every morning he lingered in the kitchen just a bit longer than usual, glancing at how folks moved around while preparing breakfast or handling small chores. He noticed details he'd never bothered with before. The way Tom, the doorman, always checked his phone when he thought no one was looking. The way Mrs. Lopez polished the dining table even when it looked spotless, and how the new maintenance guy Mike seemed to know his way around the building a little too well for someone who'd only started 2 months before. But it was Emma, the youngest staff member on his team, who really caught his eye. She had worked for Richard for nearly a year, dusting shelves filled with expensive art books and vacuuming around custom leather armchairs. She was quiet, kept to herself, and usually drifted through rooms almost unnoticed, just a background presence in his otherwise carefully composed life. Emma would finish her shift right before evening, hair pulled back tight, her uniform always clean. Until now, Richard had barely remembered her name, but something about her movements, just a little too deliberate, a pause too long in the hallway, made him wonder. One Thursday evening, when the days were getting shorter and Chicago winds made the streets feel colder than usual, Richard decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. After the office cleared out and the last lights clicked off, he waited in his apartment until nearly 9. He put on a dark coat and, blending into the shadows outside the front entrance on Dearborn Street, watched as staff trickled out. When Emma appeared, she barely glanced up, her stride quick, bag slung over one shoulder. Richard kept his distance, matching her pace from a half-block back, careful not to attract attention. Down the sidewalk, past the jazz bar with neon lights, he followed her, feeling awkward, almost foolish, like a character in one of the old detective novels he used to read as a teenager. But he had to know. For the first time in years, someone in his perfectly controlled world had become a real mystery to him. Trailing Emma across the chilly Chicago streets, Richard found himself plunged into a world he hadn't visited in years. He followed her through crowds of commuters near the Red Line, the sounds of the city swelling with every step, car horns blaring, snippets of conversation mixing with the distant music of a passing L train. For a moment, Richard felt oddly exposed, like someone who didn't quite belong. The smells, street food vendors grilling hot dogs, the faint bite of exhaust, coffee, brewing in corner shops, were a far cry from the polished, over-perfumed air of his penthouse. Emma's route was clearly familiar to her. She wove in and out of groups of people without missing a beat, never hesitating or glancing behind. Richard worried a little he'd lose her in the crowd, but there was something determined about the way she moved. He noticed the careful way she clutched her bags, knuckles white against the cold. The city at this hour was both alive and weary, people pushing home with tired faces and hunched shoulders. Richard realized he usually saw this world from behind glass, windows of town cars, restaurant booths, or boardroom views high above the noise. Finally, after what felt like miles but was really a few blocks, Emma turned down a side street lined with narrow apartment buildings. The structure she entered was old, 3 stories, faded bricks, Christmas lights left up around the windows even though it was only November. The paint was chipped, and the little entryway was cluttered with mismatched shoes and mail. Richard stood at the corner, unsure what to do now. He waited as she unlocked the door and climbed upstairs, bags resting heavy against her side. There was a slowness in her walk, like she was carrying more than just groceries. Looking at the scene, Richard thought about his own routine, about how insulated it had become. He wondered what Emma's life was like, what weighed on her more than the bags in her hands. For the first time, his sense of order and control flickered. He realized how little he knew about the people moving around him every day. There was a strange comfort in the warm colors leaking from Emma's apartment window, a simple sign of someone making their way through the world, holding on to small joys despite everything. Richard stayed a while, letting real city life settle over him, quietly observing the ordinary and extraordinary reality he'd never bothered to notice before. Pressed quietly against the peeling wall in the dim hallway, Richard kept still and listened, hardly believing where he had followed Emma. He was out of place here, feeling awkward in his expensive coat and shoes as he tried to remain unseen. From just beyond the door of her apartment, he could hear the soft creak as Emma entered, and then her voice changed so quickly. It was gentle, caring in a way Richard had never heard at work. Right away, a young boy's voice answered. Richard recognized the worry in the boy's words before he could really make out what was being said. Emma greeted the child. His name was Owen, Richard would later realize, with such patience that Richard's chest tightened. Owen whispered about the pills running out, about feeling sick again, his sentences tumbling over one another in a rush. He was scared, saying he had not been able to sleep because the coughing kept him awake and his head hurt so much. Emma set down her bags and quietly reassured him, promising that she'd brought what she could and that they would get through this together. Richard imagined the items from his building, cold medicine, antibiotics, snacks, passed gently into Owen's small hands. At that moment, Richard felt a sharp pang in his gut. Everything became suddenly clear. This was not theft, not in the greedy sense he had assumed. It was desperation, a quiet kind that had gone completely unnoticed in his world of schedules and financial reports. Richard realized just how wrong he had been, mistaking Emma's actions as some petty crime when the truth was so much heavier. He pictured his own well-stocked shelves, medicine cabinets filled for emergencies that never seemed to come. He thought about the lunches he left unfinished, the simple comforts he took for granted. Here, in a small, drafty apartment just blocks away from his elegant high-rise, a child waited each day, unsure if he would have what he needed to get to tomorrow. The shame Richard felt surprised him. He finally understood how invisible people's struggles could become if no one bothered to look. All the neat rules and order in his life suddenly seemed flimsy. Emma was not breaking the rules. For herself, she was making sacrifices for someone else's survival. For the first time, Richard saw his own distance, his own blindness. The realization landed hard, and he stood there quietly, confronted by a new feeling he could not easily shake off. The next day seemed to move in slow motion for Richard. He sat at his kitchen table, watching the steam rise and fade from his morning coffee, unable to bring himself to take even a single sip. His mind replayed the night before, again and again. The look on Owen's face, the hushed sound of Emma's voice, the way the apartment's worn furniture stood in contrast to the opulence of his own home. Everything that had seemed so clear and routine now felt distant, as if his life was happening to someone else. He noticed every detail that morning with new eyes. When Emma arrived for work, Richard saw her moving through the apartment just as she always did, but something was different. Her movements were tight, almost mechanical. She dusted the tables and straightened magazines with hands that weren't quite steady. Her eyes, which usually avoided his, seemed dull and shadowed, as though she was carrying a weight far heavier than her cleaning caddy. The memory of her voice as she comforted Owen echoed in his mind, and Richard's chest ached. He wanted to say something, to ask if she and Owen were all right, but every time he opened his mouth, the words just dissolved. He was suddenly aware of the subtle gap that had always existed between them, a space filled with his indifference and her need for privacy. A whole lifetime spent keeping distance from the people around him now made Richard feel helpless. Speaking up felt impossible. His own voice seemed foreign and awkward, and he found himself glued to silence out of habit as much as fear. More than once, he caught himself staring at Emma, searching for some clue to what she needed, something he could give, a gesture that wouldn't come across as pity or condescension. He watched as she moved from room to room, catching her pausing every now and then, her mind somewhere far away. Richard realized that it was not just last night's discovery that had set him adrift, but a long-term habit of ignoring the private struggles of others. Before now, he had always believed that boundaries kept things neat and professional, but now those same boundaries felt like a wall that kept him on the outside looking in. For the first time, Richard longed to step across that silent distance, but didn't know how, or even if he had the right to try. Haunted by the memory of what he'd witnessed the night before, Richard found himself unable to look at Emma in quite the same way. The professional distance he'd kept now felt strange and forced, as if he could no longer pretend he didn't know a piece of her secret world. All day long, every time he glimpsed her in the hall or caught the quiet sound of her footsteps in another room, that restless ache in his chest returned. He found himself thinking of Owen, wondering how children like him managed in a city as fierce as Chicago, and how many more stories like Emma's might be quietly unfolding just out of sight. As the afternoon wore on, Richard's thoughts grew too heavy to ignore. He watched the clock as the last minutes of the workday ticked by, mind spinning, until finally he decided he could not sit with his nerves any longer. He left the office a few paces behind Emma. This was not about suspicion anymore. He was simply drawn by curiosity and concern, a need to see past his own bubble. Emma made her way north, weaving through the rush-hour crowd with her usual careful pace. She stopped at a small, weathered brick building a few blocks off the main avenue. Richard almost walked by without noticing the place. But then he saw the modest wooden sign, Davis Community Center. He hesitated on the sidewalk, peering inside, through the glass. Inside, what Richard saw surprised him. Gone was Emma's timid manner. Instead, she stood at the center of a noisy, welcoming room, surrounded by a group of children gathered in a loose, cheerful circle. With an open storybook in her hands, Emma's voice rang out clear and confident as she brought a tale to life. The kids sat rapt, their faces shining, some leaning against her legs or waving their hands to answer questions. Every few pages, Emma asked them questions or invited them to act out scenes, and laughter filled the air. She had an easy warmth and gentle command that seemed to draw everyone in closer. Richard suddenly understood that this was why she rushed home each night, why she carried so much worry on her shoulders. Here, she was more than just a housekeeper. She was a teacher, a guide, a source of comfort and hope for children who needed someone steady to rely on. Watching her, Richard felt something inside him shift for good, a sense of respect growing where there once had been only distance. There was no paycheck or praise waiting for Emma at the end of this work. She did it because someone had to, because these kids deserved kindness, and she was willing to give it. Standing outside that modest community center, Richard felt a mix of admiration and embarrassment swirling inside him. All this time, he'd seen Emma as just another part of his well-oiled household, a person who blended into the background and never seemed to ask for anything. Now, watching her read stories to a group of lively kids and seeing how the room seemed to revolve around her, he realized how wrong his earlier judgments had been. It hit him that her quiet routines hid a level of courage and kindness he'd never even thought to imagine. Richard's mind wandered back through his years of success and collecting, always chasing the next deal or upgrade, always making sure everything in his life was planned down to the last detail. He thought that keeping things tidy and predictable had made him wise, or at least safe. But he saw now that it had also made him blind. The hopes, fears, and silent battles of the people in his life had slipped right by him. He started to really see not just Emma, but also the others who came and went in his world, each carrying their own story. He remembered times he'd brushed aside small signs, like when someone at work had looked tired but said nothing, or when Emma had quietly asked for different cleaning supplies and he had dismissed the request with barely a thought. Seeing her here now, pouring herself out for these children, and then going home to care for Owen, made his own priorities seem shallow and flimsy. The victories he'd held up as achievements felt hollow compared to the way Emma moved from task to task, supporting not from a place of power, but out of love and necessity. His routine, once a symbol of his control, took on a different meaning. Every morning coffee, every set meeting, every carefully organized cabinet seemed less about living and more about hiding from life's messier questions. What had he missed behind all his thick walls and polished surfaces? How many times had he put a need for order ahead of basic kindness or curiosity? Richard realized he had never really let himself wonder about the dreams and struggles of the people around him. Now, as he watched Emma tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear and brighten a child's face with a simple joke, he felt the urge to know more, to listen, to be present, and to let some of that courage rub off on him. This moment, unexpected as it was, opened a new chapter in how he wanted to move through the world. Something inside Richard shifted after that evening at the community center. For the first time in years, he felt a clear urge not just to watch from a distance, but to do something that mattered to someone besides himself. He spent the night thinking about Emma and Owen, about all the invisible barriers that regular people faced every day in Chicago while he floated above them. By morning, he'd made up his mind. A few days later, Richard found out where Emma went every other Friday, the Lincoln Park Neighborhood Clinic. It was a humble building squeezed between a laundromat and an old bakery. Richard waited quietly. In the lobby, his presence almost comically out of sync with the worn walls and the busy, tired faces around him. Still, he was determined to see for himself what Emma confronted so often. He watched as Emma spoke softly to the receptionist, clutching a file and gently urging Owen, who looked pale and much smaller than Richard remembered, to sit down. The nurse frowned and shook her head slowly, while Emma explained that they needed the next round of medicine. He could see the grind unfolding, insurance questions, computer screens flashing red, that chorus of, "I'm sorry, we can't," again and again. Emma didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she stood firm, though her hands trembled slightly as she pleaded in a careful, controlled way, her pride forcing her to keep her head high. Richard felt every tense moment, sitting just out of sight. On impulse, he walked up and quietly used his name. For the first time, he flashed his business card not to get into a restaurant or an event, but to open a door for someone else. In just a few minutes, the problem, once impossible, was suddenly fixable, the medicine promised for pickup by the afternoon. Emma turned and saw him just as the conversation ended. Her face didn't soften. Instead, she studied him with a resigned look, one he recognized as a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. When Richard gently offered to help in any other way, Emma's voice was steady and cold. She thanked him, but made it clear that she wanted no handouts, no charity. What she valued above all was dignity, for herself and for Owen. Richard nodded, finally understanding what true help and respect meant. There were things money could speed up, but some things, like pride and self-worth, could never be bought. Walking out of the clinic that day, Richard was left thinking about the brief but unforgettable conversation with Emma. He could still see the way she had straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye, as if daring him to treat her with anything less than respect. For so long, he had assumed that his wealth could smooth over any struggle, but in that moment, standing in front of the chipped reception desk with a line of tired patients behind him, Richard realized that real strength was not just about having money or connections. It was about the ability to keep going, to push back against impossible odds with quiet determination. Emma's pride and steady resolve made him suddenly aware of how much comfort and ease had shielded him from ever needing those kinds of muscles. Back at his penthouse overlooking the city, Richard drifted through his usual routine, but everything seemed smaller and more hollow than it had before. His walls were covered with awards, framed certificates, sleek trophies, signed photographs, memories from decades of relentless work and success. Before, he had found satisfaction in seeing all these proofs of his accomplishment. Now they felt like empty reminders that he had been chasing something that never quite filled him up. None of his prized achievements, he realized, could hold a candle to the struggle Emma faced every day for the sake of her son. Instead of reaching for his usual sense of control, writing a check, giving instructions, fixing things on his terms, Richard sat down and tried to think about what it meant to help without taking dignity away. He didn't want to be another rich guy who offered charity like a bandage. Emma had made it painfully clear that real support should let people stand on their own feet, not make them feel small. That night, Richard searched for new ways to make a difference, starting with the community center he'd seen Emma commit so much of her time to. Maybe he could help out quietly, from the background, where kids like Owen and hard-working parents like Emma could feel empowered, respected, and never like they owed someone in return. In a city as big and busy as Chicago, Richard saw that kindness needed to be more than a favor from above. It had to blend into the cracks, offering help where it was welcome and stepping back where pride called for space. It was the beginning of a change he hoped would reach further than just himself. The next week, Richard wanted to put his new intentions into action. Instead of drawing up a large check or making a show, he decided to keep things simple. He spent a night at home, sorting through his own oversized library, picking out books that he thought would light up a kid's face. He added a few new titles. From a small bookstore down the street, one suggested by the employee, who knew exactly what local kids loved. With a few sturdy boxes packed and taped, Richard headed over to the Davis Community Center, where he had first seen Emma's other life unfold. He arrived during one of the afternoon story sessions, the hall already buzzing with the chatter of children and the soft scrape of chairs on the floor. Richard slipped in quietly, trying not to disrupt the warmth filling the room. He set the boxes down near the door and waited until Emma finished her reading. Soon, the room's attention shifted to the look of curiosity on Emma's face as she opened the top box. She pulled out a colorful cover, and a smile spread across her usually calm features. The kids almost immediately crowded around the boxes, their hands flipping eagerly through pages, chattering about which stories they wanted Emma to read next, or how they would help each other with the bigger words. The moment was noisy and a little chaotic, but it felt fresh and genuine, nothing like the stiff events Richard was used to attending in his business life. Emma glanced up at him, her eyes meeting his, and in that brief moment, Richard sensed her silent thanks. She did not gush or try to fill the space with words, but her nod and small smile spoke more than enough. What struck Richard most was the way he was pulled into the room's energy. Nobody asked what he did for a living or how much money he had in the bank. Instead, he was just there, a part of something simple and joyful. Emma accepted his help, not as charity, but as another piece in the puzzle of hope she tried every week to build for those kids. That afternoon was only a small exchange, but it laid out the start of a new connection. Richard didn't feel like a guest anymore, or an outsider looking in. He felt, for the first time in a long while, like he belonged. Just another hand, helping carry the weight, no strings attached. As the weeks rolled on, Richard started dropping by the Davis Community Center more and more. At first, he would show up just to deliver more books or help move some tables around, thinking he would slip out before anyone noticed. But pretty soon routine became habit, and he realized he actually wanted to stay. The center had this uncomplicated feeling of welcome, a kind of warmth and laughter that wasn't about what anyone owned or how important they were. Richard liked that nobody asked him for his resume or expected a speech. He wasn't there as a donor or a guest of honor. He was just another pair of hands. It was that sense of simply belonging, of doing something useful with no reward or recognition attached, that kept drawing him back. He started, helping out whenever he could, sometimes reading stories or helping the kids with their homework, other times just listening as they told him about their days. In the world of business where Richard had spent most of his life, things could be cold and transactional. But at the center, everything was about small acts of kindness, a helping hand, a listening ear, a shared laugh. Over time, Richard found himself looking forward to Wednesdays or Fridays at the center more than to any awards dinner or client meeting. His connection with Owen also deepened, almost without him realizing. Owen was shy at first, sticking close to Emma and barely looking up when Richard was nearby. Slowly, though, things changed. One afternoon, Richard found himself showing Owen how to make a paper airplane. Another day, they ended up sitting side by side, heads bent over a science book, both curious about how tornadoes formed in the Midwest. Richard learned not to rush or push, but to simply be present, letting Owen come to him in his own time. Eventually, other kids started calling Richard by his first name, and he felt oddly proud the first time someone asked if he'd return next week. The relationships forming around him were quiet but strong, built on simple trust and real attentiveness. Somewhere along the way, Richard stopped feeling like he was giving anything away. He had stepped into a space where every conversation, every shared snack, every little joke mattered, and for the first time in many years, he felt his own story shifting in ways he had never expected. These new friendships brought out a part of him he had nearly forgotten, touched by care that asked nothing in return. Richard's changing routine didn't go unnoticed at Palmer and Stern, the investment firm he had helped build from scratch. There was a shift in the air almost as soon as he began trading power lunches and strategy sessions for afternoons at the community center. Some days he missed meetings or showed up late, which was unheard of before, when it came time to approve extra funding for small community initiatives, requests that he would have dismissed as low priority in the past. He no longer hesitated. He greenlit several of them, insisting that returns didn't always have to be measured in cold, hard numbers. News of these changes made its way around the office faster than any market rumor, and soon whispers filled the halls. Some people respected his new direction. Others, especially the most ambitious partners, wondered if Richard had lost his edge. The most difficult conversation came from within his own family. His cousin, Laura, was both a senior partner at the firm and the last of Richard's close relatives. She scheduled a late-night meeting one Thursday, showing up in his office with a look that mixed concern with frustration. Laura didn't dance around the subject. She asked why he was spending less time at the firm and why he was throwing company money at programs with no proven track record. In her view, these decisions smacked of carelessness, or worse, weakness. Laura's voice sharpened as she questioned if Richard was deserting everything they had worked for their entire lives. He tried to explain the change he'd been feeling, talking about Emma, Owen, and the simple happiness he found at the center. But Laura heard something different. That the old Richard she could count on, the one obsessed with results, might be fading away. For Laura, loyalty meant holding the line, keeping Palm and Stern on track and protecting what their family had built. For Richard, it was becoming more and more about impact, about helping in ways that didn't show up easily on spreadsheets. They argued for nearly an hour. Laura saw risks and distractions, while Richard saw new meaning breaking through the old patterns. By the end, Richard was troubled. He felt the growing distance, not just between him and Laura, but between who he had been and who he was becoming. The center of his world was shifting, and there was no way to pretend the change hadn't happened. Despite all the tension back at Palmer and Stern and the arguments with Laura, Richard found his world outside the financial district growing larger and brighter by the week. He sometimes stopped to take stock of these shifts on quiet mornings, walking Michigan Avenue with a coffee in hand and thinking about how far his life had come from the boardrooms and high-rises. At the Davis Community Center, things kept moving in simple, steady ways. Richard's conversations with Emma became a fixture of his days. They no longer spoke only in snatches between volunteer duties or out of necessity. Instead, there was a genuine back and forth, where they could share memories, worries, or laugh about the unpredictable things the kids said during story hour. Richard was surprised by just how much he learned from these exchanges, not only about Emma's world, but about his own blind spots, the quiet possibilities in every relationship, and what really matters when no one is watching. Little by little, Richard realized that the best parts of his week happened at the center. Every Saturday, he would help set up chairs for art activities, or help serve snacks to a handful of regular kids whose names he now knew by heart. It was in these small, almost unnoticed moments that he felt a sense of belonging no award or press mention had ever given him. The kids didn't care if his last name appeared in the papers or if he ran a big firm. Emma, too, was never impressed by status symbols. She measured worth by reliability and kindness, not wealth. With each new week, Richard's sense of self shifted away from his role as a so-called mogul and more towards something whole and honest. He liked that nobody at the center expected favors or handouts. They just needed someone who showed up and listened genuinely. Here, status and fame fell away, and what remained was simple presence, a willingness to pitch in, to pay attention, to try. That, more than anything, grounded him, making the work at the community center feel not like a duty, but a natural, joyful part of life. The bonds forming there had nothing to do with what he owned or how many zeros were in his bank account. Instead, they grew from his efforts to connect, to support, and to share moments that were meaningful to everyone involved. Months had passed since Richard made the community center such a big part of his days, and each week seemed to bring him closer to the families there. He kept showing up, listening, and being useful wherever possible, and he felt like a different person, someone more present, less concerned with the trappings of his business success. Then, everything shifted again. Owen, who by now looked up to Richard and would wave excitedly whenever he arrived, suddenly grew quiet and withdrawn. Emma was distracted, her usually steady smile stretched thin. Richard learned the truth one chilly Tuesday when Emma finally explained. Owen needed surgery, and not one of those simple procedures, but something urgent and serious. The words left a heaviness in the air, and Richard saw exhaustion and worry etched into every line on Emma's face. Still, she hesitated before telling him, not wanting to turn her fears or her tiredness into anyone else's burden. Richard offered whatever support he could think of, rides, meals, someone to talk to, but Emma kept her guard up. It was only after a long pause, and with a hint of embarrassment, that she agreed he could come with them to the hospital. On the day of the surgery, Richard found himself sitting beside Emma in the waiting area, surrounded by the steady hum of nerves and hospital announcements. The familiar security that came from being a man of means faded away. Richard knew he could not buy certainty or fast forward to the outcome. No donation or contact in the city was going to change what happened. Behind those closed operating room doors, he recognized that for the first time in years, none of his influence or wealth mattered at all. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, trying to be steady for Emma, offering nothing beyond his quiet presence and hope. Emma leaned forward in her chair, twisting her hands and staring at the same spot on the floor for ages, while Richard waited with her. No one spoke much, or needed to. He simply stayed, sharing in the long stretches of anxious silence, understanding now that often the best support you can give someone is just to show up and stay beside them. In that space, the limits of power became clear, and Richard learned how to hope, worry, and finally just be there for someone who needed him. The hours in the waiting room passed slowly, every sound in the hallway making Emma tense up, and Richard, finding himself counting the tiles on the wall just to fill the time. It felt as if the hospital existed outside the usual rules of time and place. Just them, the bright lights, and the endless waiting for news. When a nurse finally appeared, her smile was kind but careful, and she spoke simply. Owen's surgery had gone well. The operation was a success, and he would need some time to recover, but the worst was over. Emma let out a breath she must have been holding for half the day. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, letting out a shaky laugh that edged toward tears. All of the careful strength she had worn melted away, and for once she just let herself feel everything at once: relief, fear, gratitude. When she looked up, she didn't hide the tears in her eyes. She thanked Richard in a soft, honest voice, admitting that having him there made a difference, that she might never have asked for support, but she realized she could not have gone through it alone. A moment of real connection settled between them, one that didn't rely on what either of them had, but on what they shared in that quiet space. Word travels fast in communities like theirs, especially when something goes wrong and then right again. Over the next week, Richard noticed little changes. On his next visit to the community center, someone had left a small vase of wildflowers on the counter with a card that simply said, "Thank you for being here." One of the older boys handed him a folded drawing, a crayon sketch of the hospital waiting room with two stick figures sitting together. Neighbors who barely nodded before now greeted him with real smiles. Sometimes a parent would drop off a batch of homemade cookies for volunteers, sneaking a few extras into Richard's hands for the road. These gestures were not huge or dramatic, but each one meant something. Richard realized that the care he had started to give, quiet, steady, and with no expectation, was coming back to him in small, genuine ways. He saw now that the lines separating his world from the communities were fading. His decision to simply show up and share himself was breaking down old walls, and the gratitude he received was shaping him just as much as anything he had given. The days that followed felt different for Richard and Emma. Even with Owen's recovery taking up much of their energy, they discovered a quiet rhythm in this new chapter. There were forms to fill out, doctors to call back, and countless check-ins with nurses who seemed to have a language all their own. Instead of feeling awkward or out of place, Richard found comfort in the routine. He and Emma would take turns, tracking medication times, sorting out insurance details, or handling paperwork that never seemed to end. These little chores, once a source of annoyance or anxiety for Richard, now just seemed part of being there for someone. Every night, as the hospital corridors settled into their quiet hum, Richard and Emma would sit by Owen's bedside and talk. Sometimes the conversations were about what restaurant in Chicago had the best coffee or childhood stories that surfaced from nowhere. Other nights, the talk was heavier, fears about the future, talk of old disappointments or battles lost and won. Emma admitted how hard it was to trust new people, and Richard found himself opening up about his own regrets, about all the times he wondered if his work had meant much to anyone at all. They both realized they had carried a lot of their lives alone, pretending loneliness was just another part of being strong. It was during these long evenings, with the skyline of the city shining just beyond the window, that something changed between them. There was a comfort in the silences they shared, the kind that did not have to be filled with words. Richard felt himself lowering the usual walls, exploring lost parts of his life he had always kept hidden, like old hurts that never quite healed, and that constant search for a place to truly belong. Sometimes Emma would just nod, her quiet understanding a relief after so many years of talking to people who only wanted results. Little by little, it became clear that this friendship was not just about supporting Owen or getting through the next day. It was about helping each other rebuild from the things that had been broken, by time, by mistakes, by the weight of past choices. In coming together, Emma and Richard saw that maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find a way forward, stronger and a little less alone than before. It was during one of those long evenings in the hospital when Megan, Emma's younger sister, appeared almost out of nowhere. Richard and Emma had just finished sorting through Owen's medication schedule for the next day when a gentle knock sounded on the hospital door. Emma paused, looking surprised and then just a touch anxious. The two sisters had not seen each other for several years, years marked by misunderstandings and the stubborn silence that sometimes grew between family. Richard instinctively stood and stepped back, giving the sisters some space. The air in the room changed as Megan stepped inside, nervously shifting a shopping bag filled with get-well cards and snacks from one hand to the other. At first, words seemed to get stuck. Megan just looked at Emma with teary eyes that tried to smile, as if she wanted to say 100 things at once, but had no idea where to start. Emma held Owen's hand and finally managed a soft, "Hi." That single word carried relief and sadness all tangled together. Megan found her seat, close but not quite touching, and they sat in a silence that was full of old memories. Slowly, as the minutes ticked by, the tension started to fade. Megan offered Owen a tiny stuffed bear, and Richard quietly slipped out to get some coffee, allowing the sisters those first moments alone. The awkwardness gave way to stories about growing up in the suburbs just outside Chicago, bike rides by the lake, family cookouts at Millennium Park, even squabbles over who got the last slice of Lou Malnati's deep dish pizza. There was laughter again, tentative at first, but then spilling out when one memory turned funnier than the last. Having her sister back brought an unexpected lightness to Emma's face. For so long she had carried all her worries on her own, pretending she did not need help, when the truth was she just missed sharing the load with someone who knew her heart. With Megan there, Emma could let her guard down. She was able to joke, to talk honestly without worrying about judgment or misunderstanding, and together they learned to face each new challenge with a little less dread and a lot more hope. For both sisters, this was a chance to start over, letting forgiveness and shared laughter smooth over old wounds and guide them toward better days as a real family once more. Life at the hospital settled into a new rhythm after Megan's return, and there was a different energy around Emma. It was as if sharing the heavy load with her sister and with Richard gave her new strength to face things she had once thought impossible. That sense of renewal grew even stronger when Emma received an unexpected email one morning. The message was from the organizing committee of the Midwest Education Summit, inviting her to be a speaker and share her story of persistence, motherhood, and the struggles she had overcome for Owen's sake. At first, Emma could barely believe it. Her first reaction was to politely decline, convinced that conferences were for people with credentials and connections, not for someone who managed daily life one day at a time. She remembered past moments where her voice had been overlooked or dismissed, and the thought of taking the stage in front of hundreds of educators and community leaders made her stomach turn. She confessed her doubts to Richard while they waited for one of Owen's follow-up appointments. Richard listened, then told her in his gentle way that her story mattered because it was real, because she lived it. He reminded her that every person in the audience had something to learn from courage, honesty, and the raw reality of not giving up. Megan, too, chimed in with support, insisting that Emma deserved her place in that spotlight as much as anyone else. Even with encouragement pouring in from both sides, it was not easy for Emma to shake the sense that she was stepping somewhere she did not belong. The night before the summit, Richard and Megan helped her practice in the hospital's family lounge, taking turns as her audience. Emma laughed at her nerves, but their little applause gave her the extra push she needed. When the day of the summit finally came around, Emma stood backstage, heart-pounding, staring out at the packed rows of seats. As her name was called, she remembered to stand tall. On stage, her voice found its power, not by being polished or perfect, but by being steady and honest. She spoke of her journey, of feeling unseen and learning to keep showing up anyway. The crowd was silent, then gave her a long, warm round of applause. After the talk, several people approached her with contacts, resources, and notes of thanks. Opportunities seemed to bloom from her courage and vulnerability, and for the first time, Emma believed that maybe her story could light the way for others who needed to hear it. 12 months after Emma's talk at the Midwest Education Summit, Richard's life looked nothing like it once had. He was still on the board of directors at Ramsey Investments, but the company he had centered his world around no longer defined most of his days. Instead, It was the slow mornings spent at the Edison Community Center that brought him the deepest sense of fulfillment. He looked forward to Saturdays, when the center buzzed with activity, from literacy classes to art workshops, and even the occasional cooking session with neighborhood families. Richard enjoyed lingering over coffee and easy conversation with Emma and Owen, talking about everything and nothing, without feeling the need to rush away to some urgent meeting. Through all these changes, Richard grew closer to his daughter, Emily, than he had ever imagined possible. Before, their relationship was polite but often strained, always circling around business updates or school achievements in a way that never touched something real. Now, conversations between them ran deeper. They talked about mistakes, regrets, hopes, and how to forgive, not just others, but themselves. Many evenings Emily would join him at the center, sometimes volunteering, other times simply sharing a meal with Richard and the friends he had made. They both admitted, after dancing around the subject for months, that they missed the time lost between them and promised not to waste any more of it, pretending things were fine when they really needed each other. One crisp afternoon, Richard and Emily sat together on a park bench outside the center, sunlight filtering through old sycamore trees. Richard opened up about something he had been privately wrestling with, his worries about what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. For so long, he believed that holding his fortune tightly was the only way to keep his family safe. Now, he saw it differently. "I want to build something lasting for the community, not just for our name on a building," he told Emily. She smiled in relief, admitting she had hoped he would come to that conclusion. Richard then told Emily about his plans to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting local families, education, and neighborhood projects. He wanted Emma to serve as one of its key advisors, knowing how much wisdom came from living through real struggle and refusing to give up. This new idea gave meaning to everything he had learned in the past year, showing that genuine wealth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he could help create with others. The seasons rolled on, with the leaves turning gold and drifting down the sidewalks outside the Edison Community Center, and the air in Chicago growing crisp as winter crept in. Richard and Emma slowly found a way of being together that felt natural and easy, without putting pressure on themselves or trying to define everything in a hurry. They shared early cups of coffee on park benches, sat together in comfortable silence while Owen finished his homework at the kitchen table, and sometimes just walked without talking, enjoying the comfort of being side by side. It was not about grand gestures or elaborate declarations. What mattered most was just showing up for each other, day after day. Emma noticed that Richard often seemed to know what she needed before she asked. He would cover for her at the center when she needed a quiet moment, or make sure the car was warm for her early morning medical shifts. For Richard, the biggest surprise was how peaceful it felt not to have all the answers, to realize he could be vulnerable and still be valued. They built a gentle routine filled with little kindnesses, splitting sandwiches at the deli down the street, cheering Owen on at his first debate meet, or simply listening at the end of a hard day, not to solve problems, but just to understand. Owen, too, was finding his own place in this new life. Always quiet as a child, he began to step forward in the community, first by speaking up at youth meetings, then helping organize a clothing drive for families in need. As he found his voice, people started to listen. Teachers at school asked him to talk with younger students about the importance of empathy and support. Owen never tried to draw attention to himself, but his honest, hopeful message resonated. More and more, he became a young leader, someone who reminded those around him that being seen, truly seen, could change everything. Surrounded by new friends and family who had come together not through luck, but through choice and care, Richard realized what it meant to finally be at home. The city was the same. Busy, unpredictable, full of challenges, But for the first time in his life, he did not feel out of place. He had found his sense of belonging not in titles or success, but in the day-to-day connections with others. Here, in this web of simple acts and shared hopes, Richard felt a peace that had always seemed just out of reach, learning that home was never a building, it was the people he chose to love.